morning, everybody. Thank you, Peter. That was really interesting. How many of you are mentally comfortable after that hour? Raise your hand. Anybody? I can't see everybody because of the lights. One, Lee. Yeah, good for you. Todd.
I have an existential philosophy degree.
Oh, I guess you need that then. Well, since nobody is comfortably mentally, I'm assuming that your bottoms are all comfortable, though. How are these chairs?
Awesome.
Right? Can we get some applause for the leather and the padding and whatnot? So 5 years ago, Cliff had the first of these in Chicago, and I walked in the room and I saw the big leather chairs and thought, oh, that's not a good idea. First of all, they're white, so they get messed up. Second of all, people are going to be asleep, right? Well, the test of how good the session was that nobody slept. And as good as these chairs are, right, if you do need to take a nap, please don't snore, because your neighbors probably won't appreciate it. But this chair notion has become part of the fabric of this conference. I think it's unique, it's interesting, and I think the conversations here are unique and interesting. So I look forward to being part of it with all of you in the next couple of days. My conversation about AI really isn't about AI, it's about intelligent automation, which is really how companies are transforming their businesses from what I would say sort of deterministic, old school technology to the new age, right? And I think Peter brought up a lot of very interesting concepts that I think can apply to your businesses and the guidance that you give your teams today. In fact, Friday I was with one of our clients, interestingly enough, a technology client. They were an SI, and they were going through a reorganization. They were going from a geo-based organization to a line of business organization. One of their questions to me was, how do we deal with all this change in the context of this reorg? It's confusing enough with the reorg. How do we manage this stuff? So I shared with them 3 concepts, or frameworks, that I'll share with you. And then more importantly, I wanted to share for the first time in an audience outside of our own firm, the results of some very contemporary research that we are just finishing up in the firm with 200 of the largest firms in terms of revenue internationally and in the US, around how they're adopting AI, cloud, and data into the transformation of their businesses going forward. So super interesting stuff. I hope you'll appreciate it. Let me start off with these frameworks that I share with my client. The first one, interestingly enough, dovetails super nicely with what Peter just said, which is this issue of how fast things are moving. You saw lots of slides before about, the dynamics of change, Moore's law, et cetera. The fact of the matter is, we have a problem. It's a clock speed dilemma. And I think a lot of management teams now are very frustrated because they're trying to figure out how do we keep doing what we're doing, to keep up with this. And a lot of people don't know this about me, but even in my own firm, but my first job out of college was in the Merchant Marine. In fact, I went to school in the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy, which was blocks away from where Peter grew up in Great Neck, New York. The maritime industry in 1850 lost half of its market share to steam. And it wasn't until 1907 with the sinking of the Thomas Lawson, which was a ridiculous-looking supertanker with 9 masts and a hull that was massive, its sinking proved that sail would not win the battle. But 37 years of transition, right? We don't have 37 years in the times we're dealing with today. Those times in the mechanical systems that we saw in the Industrial Revolution increased productivity 100-fold. So there was an inflection point in labor. Back in the 50s and 60s and 70s, we saw the advent of computers, and we became part of the information age. That 35-year journey in that S-curve also increased productivity 100-fold with people. And what we're experiencing today, I'd argue, is a labor inflection point. We didn't quite see it with the internet. We didn't really see it in the early parts of 2000, but when you add the AI component to data and ubiquitous access to technology, you will have a platform for 100-fold plus increases in labor productivity. We've already started to see this in experimentation. We've seen it in oncology, whether it's lung cancer with Memorial Sloan Kettering. We've seen it elsewhere. We've seen silos of it. And we are at the precipice today of seeing this at scale, which is, in fact, I think, the point at where we're at. companies going from POCs to scale in the enterprise. The other framework that I shared with the client was what we call the 21st century enterprise, which is how do you look at connecting your enterprise from the front to the back to account for the changes you need to make. You can't go deep and go into one stovepipe and go all the way to implementation there and expect that to have a difference. In fact, what you'll find culturally and from a workforce standpoint, it's very disruptive and counterproductive. You've got to think of things across the enterprise as well as in these silos. But from a customer standpoint, that's a really key factor for change. Technology today is allowing us to identify differently, personalize differently, and engage differently. Even have different business models. We talked about Uber and Lyft, Airbnb, et cetera. It's totally changed the dynamic of how customers engage with the provider of service. Mark Andreessen said, software is eating the world. He was right. We ended Peter's discussion around data and the fact that data is a massive intangible value today. Think about 23andMe. How many of you have done a 23andMe or Ancestry.com, right? Interesting stuff. My dad used to tell me that I was part American Indian. We did the test, 0. Not a drop, right? And then he told me he used to watch a lot of cowboy and Indian movies when he was a kid, so that's why he got this Indian thing. The fact of the matter is the value of those companies isn't in their ancestry data, it's in their genomic research potential. In fact, 23andMe has FDA approval now to monetize that data for pharmas. And companies like GSK are taking note and investing heavily. The value of amalgamations of data will redefine 23andMe, and in many cases, they're redefining companies that are sitting in this room, whether you're a bank, you're a professional services firm, or you're a retailer like Amazon. Everything is a service. I asked my client to think about how that economy is growing today, not just in the things that we used to do around BPO, but things like AI and blockchain. If you can scale and descale your business as you need it and have an as-a-service agility, right, built into your architecture, that's pretty smart thinking. So think about the procurement of capability other than just organic or inorganic in the M&A context. You've got to think more agile about scaling up and scaling down. And then lastly, the workforce. Without a doubt, companies today are fixated on this issue, not just the structure of the workforce, not just the technology the workforce is leveraging, but what models they have for this workforce. How much contingency, how much gig economy, how is the workforce being employed for you? Today, a lot of companies in Silicon Valley are leveraging, what I would say communities of workers for free, whether they're user groups, right, or programmers that are fixing problems that you're offering up to them to solve compartmentalized so they don't know the client, they don't know the context, but they can help you solve for problems because people want to be relevant. Culture is a key, and leadership in the workforce is key. Today, you start to see positions like chief technology officers, et cetera, turning into transformation officers. And lastly, those 4 pillars I just talked about have to sit on an infrastructure I call the new stack for the digital world, which is centered on an enterprise data strategy. At the end of the day, the 23andMe example is exactly that. All your choices about third parties, technologies, ecosystem development, workforce, they should stem from what will make you relevant in the future. And in many cases, data will be a key piece of describing what your relevance will be to your customer base or your future customer base of the future. Infrastructurally, you should have a cloud-first mentality. Why? Because ubiquitous access to technology will be what drives growth and scalability. And at the end of the day, there is no such answer as the perfect answer. It's not going to be a private cloud answer completely. It will not be a public cloud only answer. We know it's all going to be a hybrid cloud. And by the way, having more than one cloud doesn't mean you're multi-cloud. That just means you have a lot of silos. You can silo with clouds too. You need connections between those clouds. You need a middleware that helps you translate from Azure to Bluemix, right, to AWS, those data flows that you need to create that value for your customers. And lastly, I said part of this stack is an ecosystem. Don't think about the future in the context of the capabilities you have within the 4 walls of your organization. You've got to start thinking about what third parties are critical elements of your success. For example, how many of you know when you have Amazon, for example, using many third-party retailers today leverage an Amazon backend? Amazon is part of their ecosystem. They don't have to build it. Amazon, one of the best builders of that kind of infrastructure in the world, is their infrastructure provider. So this new stack is super important. Let me shift gears and share with you some very current news on contemporary perspectives on adoption of this stuff. Like I said earlier, we had 200 clients and non-clients, so 200 of the largest firms in the US, and 100 in the US and 100 from outside of the US by revenue. And we did a lot of primary and secondary research with these companies. The secondary research included job postings, which were very interesting. Obviously, the supply side of the market has a lot of job postings, but the demand side of the market, meaning those consumers of this technology, are starting to ramp up requisitions, which is driving a talent shortage in the marketplace. But we also looked at news postings. So what are their articles of initiatives that they're doing, what strategies they want to communicate? As you might consider, that's a portal in some ways to how active they are in experimenting around this new technology set. At the end of the day, as you might expect, we saw much less of that on the demand side than the supply side, but we still saw plenty on the demand side to indicate directions of travel. From that research, we came up with 8 trends that I wanted to share with you very quickly. All of these at this level of aggregation won't be a surprise, but the details are quite interesting underneath the top of the covers. And some of them, by the way, lend themselves to what we determined and we found to be one of the largest friction points of adoption. If you think about all these trends in aggregate, we boiled up to some pretty interesting sentiments around the fear of moving too fast along a digital path. The number one fear that we found, the number one impediment, was confidence. And we'll get to that in a minute. Stepping through these individually, this slide relates to a lot of the things that we showed earlier, including my first slide around clock speed, which is interesting because now we're starting to see these things in silos, but there's a huge direction in the data that we're gathering and the sentiment that we're gathering that there's going to be a very rapid increase in spend and scalability. So 21% of those 200 companies told us that they had RPA or process automation at scale. In 3 years, 69% said they were going to have it across the enterprise at scale. Big change. 8% told us higher amalgamations of AI, like class 2 and class 3, were at scale across the enterprise. When I say higher amalgamations, more cognitive, more machine learning, et cetera. And 44% told us that in 2 or 3 years, they're going to have that at scale across the enterprise. So for 200 of the largest companies, trillions and trillions of dollars of revenue, that is a significant spend. One of the interesting points around clock speed that I shared with my client on Friday that I'll share with you around this is governance. How do you take what Peter said you got to do all the time into governance? When you think about how we govern our businesses today, it all started back with the East India Trading Company, the first global enterprise, right? And we created a governance structure and C-level positions predicated on operating our businesses with excellence. And coming from KPMG, I can tell you that we have a history of 110 years of operating really well. We can hit our targets within a couple of basis points. At the end of the day, this digital world has a different implication for governance. You're starting to see it now with chief digital officers or chief transformation officers, some very smart chief technology officers. The notion of questioning the status quo in the organization is as important as operating the status quo. Do you need 50-50? Of course you don't. But you've got to have more than 0. And what I share with my client is you have to build either a chief innovation officer or a chief digital officer. You need to have someone that is part of the rhythm of operating the business that is looking ahead to question the status quo. We saw demand growing. So from a number standpoint, in the cohort group that we called mature, which again, this material will be shared with a publication that's coming out in about a month, So hold on, I don't have it now, but I'll have it to you in about a month. We saw most of those companies in the mature category spending about $250 million a year on average on smart computers, cloud, and data. The top spenders, some of the biggest spenders in the category of the survey, were spending $1 billion annually on this phenomenon. Now, part of the challenge here is understanding, and this gets to asking the right questions, is how do you know what spend you have? My contention to you is we are in the same place we were in almost 30 years ago when we used to build these charts of icebergs with the water and all you saw was the top of the iceberg. A lot of the spending, because of democratization in this, and because business unit leaders, not CIOs, can procure a lot of this information and service, a lot of that spending is not on the radar. So part of what I think you got to ask your management teams, and as consultants ask your clients, is how are you understanding what that spend level is? And I think a lot of the realization of $250 million to $1 billion in spend comes from that understanding. I think there's a pretty dramatic miss in what people think they're spending on this technology overall. We saw them spending in customers and in insights, back office and front office, obviously this is where a lot of the RPA stuff is going, finance and accounting, and supply chain logistics. Those are the key areas. This is an obvious one, but this goes to the point of it's not one technology that solves the silver bullet problem. At the end of the day, a lot of companies have taken siloed approaches to cloud and data and AI, whether it's ML or RPA. The fact of the matter is the leaders that we're finding in the various industries that the survey covered, we're taking all three and consolidating them into a joint strategy where data drove the choices being made for smart computers and for cloud. Organizational capital. Very interesting outcome of this study. 9 in 10 of the companies realized that they needed a specific AI enterprise-wide management strategy and didn't have one. That's a huge proportion. They all acknowledged it, but they didn't know where to start. The fact of the matter is, AI, this journey isn't a technology conversation. It's maybe 10% technology. It's 90 or plus better percent business and leadership. So, first of all, if the leadership team, starting at the board, doesn't understand the imperative for change, that's part of your organizational capital you need. Building that imperative. Then your management team needs leadership to drive it to culture. And culture will be pervasive across the different groups as you start to homogenize and synthesize capabilities that will fund growth and evolution in your customer business, in your back office, et cetera, et cetera. It's not all a silo-only challenge. It's both. And so this organizational capital is critical. Governance, right? Part of the organizational capital, super important. 40% of the respondents said that the CIO was responsible for the AI strategy. And in many of those cases, the CIO didn't live in the management committee or the equivalent. That's a problem. 30% see the chief digital officer had it. Did they have a digital officer? And 30% said that line of business leaders controlled this journey for them. I think it's obvious just based on that data that not having a homogeneous perspective of your strategy is a problem. And so I think governance, including things like centers of excellence where you can bring skills around data science and machine learning experts together to be leveraged across your organization effectively and with agility, is extremely important. Controls. I had the controller of the second largest construction company a couple of weeks ago talk to me about this issue, that this is becoming a very, very hot topic on his plate as chief controller. The fact of the matter is, if it's 3 o'clock in the morning, do you know what your AI is doing? Probably not. And the idea of supervised learning works in a lab, but when you scale up to the enterprise and it's working really quickly, that can be a problem. Amazon ditched an AI recruiting tool that favored men for technical jobs. You probably know about that. How many of you remember Tay? It was a chat bot that Microsoft put in place that within one day became a racist because Twitter was feeding it, right? That got shut down quickly. And Facebook created chatbots in an experiment that created their own secret language, right? totally off the script of what the people that were designing these systems thought. So is your AI explainable? Is it controlled, meaning is it accessing data that you can legally access or from a regulatory standpoint get access to? Is it fair? And are the algorithms really doing what you wanted the way you intended them to do it? As a service, key trend coming out of this, plug and play and bind, have to be something critical in this world. And by the way, AI and blockchain are rapidly evolving in the economy as a service potentials. Keep those, watch those markets carefully, talk to the vendors, and test rapidly those capabilities. And lastly, we found a tenfold gap in spending between the ones that were leading and the ones that were following. That tenfold gap grows every single year. And for any of you in the room who understand the learning cycle that occurs in this world, the learning curve to be good at digital transformation in your organizations, understand that that gap and the exponential notion of that gap is massive. So if you're not started, get started. Experiment, start to work. It's going to be imperfect. You will be wrong, but you're more wrong if you don't start. And that information came very clear out of this survey. All of the respondents identify this today, so I don't think you're going to see a lot of hanging chads, if you will, in the marketplace of significant companies in this market space. So those are my comments. I know it was quick. I'll be around for the rest of the conference. If you have any questions, love to take them. Thank you very much.